My name is Jeannie Brown. I'm the San Diego organizer for California Common Cause.
Behind you.
And I'm also on the board of the League of Women Voters. And the League of Common Cause, MAPA, the American Constitutional Society, Empower San Diego, and I haven't listed anybody else. Bay Area Council are all involved in co-sponsoring with us on this. We hope that this will be very informative. We want this to be a way of sharing information so we all can understand the problems and try to come to some kind of, get a better idea of where we should go. In 2 hours, we're not going to solve this problem. But we hope we will get enough information that will make us all a little better informed. And with that, I think we're ready for Thad Hauser.
Hi, thanks so much to all of you for coming out on a sunny San Diego afternoon to take time out of your lives to work on a problem that couldn't be more important for our state right now. Making California government work better. Or simply making it work, as some people would say. This is a time with budget deficits, budget gridlock, a lot of vicious fights, partisan polarization. This is a time when people all around the state are rethinking how California government works and looking at various ways to blow up the boxes of California government and bring lasting fundamental change that will both change the historical sweep of this state's governing institutions and also have an important effect on all of our day-to-day lives. So this movement to reform California's Constitution is the big game in town in Sacramento right now, and it's also, most importantly, something that's being discussed at the grassroots level at meetings like this all around the state. I'm really sorry that we don't have enough chairs for all of you today, but I think that should show something about how important this debate is to so many of us. My name is Thad Hauser. I am a professor of political science at UC San Diego, and I'm also a member of the California Common Cause Board. We're co-sponsors of this event, along with the League of Women Voters, the Mexican American Political Association, Empower San Diego, the American Constitutional Society, and the Bay Area Council, the group that has been the biggest group behind the push for a constitutional convention in California. I'm going to introduce the speakers today. I'm going to talk about a few things at the beginning, and then I'm going to be the moderator of this event, which means I'm going to be merciless in holding you to 1 minute in your statements so that we can hear from as many of you as possible and helping to make sure that our question and answer system gives everyone a chance to really explore these issues in depth. So this big document right here is the California Constitution. Right, it's the length of a book. My bookmark is the American Constitution. These are really different documents, and there are a few different ways to think of the California Constitution. One way to think of it is it's the document that got us into this mess, right? It's this long, bloated litany that includes a lot of policy as well as questions about the fundamental governing institutions of California. It's got an entire article on motor vehicle fees, one on usury, so it spans the gamut. It's got a prohibition on giving dairy away as a free gift in California. So a lot of details that might not, in many people's mind, be the sort of things that James Madison would come up with to put into our U.S. Constitution. So that's one way to think of the California Constitution. Another way to think of this Constitution, it was written with a convention starting in 1878, finished and endorsed by voters in 1879, is it's a document that got our state from where it was then to the great state it is now. Right? That it's the document that helped manage these fights over the power of corporations, the power of railways, how we're going to incorporate a diverse society into an inclusive California government, that set the stage for California growing into this incredible state that we all love, that many of us grew up in, and that is now, one of the biggest economic powers in the world. Right? So that would be an argument for a little bit of a conservative approach with a small c towards looking at how much we want to change this document. I think the best way to look at this document is it's a document that sets itself up for change. It asks to be amended, revised, or perhaps even thrown out in a way that the U.S. Constitution doesn't. And it's incredibly different for anyone who's been involved in, say, the ERA fight or the fight to have a flag burning amendment. It's incredibly difficult to amend the U.S. Constitution. That's why we've only done it, what, 17 or 29 times since the Bill of Rights, right? The California Constitution makes it easy to be rewritten. And it sets forth 3 processes to do that. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today, right? If there's a consensus that California is broken, we need to reach a consensus on how to fix it and what's the smartest route forward. And let me just briefly outline those 3 general approaches and the variations on the theme, and then you're going to hear different things from different panelists about the approaches that they think. So there are 3 ways to do it. One way is by amending the Constitution. And this is something that we do just about every election with all of our ballot propositions. So many of our ballot propositions actually change this fundamental governing structure of California and go into the Constitution. So you can amend the Constitution with a majority vote in favor of a constitutional amendment ballot proposition during any election, any statewide election. Right? And that can be done in 2 ways. Right? You can either put it on through the citizen initiative process, which means normally paid signature gatherers qualifying an initiative, or the legislature by a 2/3 vote in each house can put something on through the amendment process. The deal with the amendment process is it's got to be one-by-one changes. You can't fundamentally revise the Constitution and have wholesale revision. You got to do it one issue at a time. But there have been some very important amendments like term limits, the amendment to professionalize the California legislature, the amendment to impose campaign contribution limits. All of these amendments are Prop 13. All of these are things that came through the initiative constitutional amendment process. Second way to do it is through a constitutional revision commission. And this is set up by the legislature, but it's not the legislature itself. It can be an elected, it can be appointed, or it can be whoever the legislature decides to set up as a blue ribbon task force of people to come up with fundamental revisions to the Constitution. Anything that they come up with will then go through the legislature, and a 2/3 vote in each house of the legislature backs it. It goes on the ballot for a majority vote of the voters. And we've done this successfully in the 1960s. We had a Constitutional Revision Commission that put up many successful initiatives, revisions that the voters backed overwhelmingly. And we failed at this in the 1990s. We had a blue ribbon task force that came in the last time we had a major deficit and a major economic crisis. But a blue ribbon task force, a revision commission in the 90s. All of their proposals ended up going nowhere in the legislature, and voters never had a chance to act on it. The third process is having an entire constitutional convention. We did this in 1849 when we wrote the Constitution. We did it from 1878 through 1879, and we haven't done it since then. And constitutional convention could be composed in different ways. You could elect the members to be on that convention. You could appoint them, or you could randomly draw them from a list of the of registered voters or any other list of Californians. And so that constitutional convention would meet, rewrite the Constitution as much as they wanted, and then their proposals would have to go before the voters. So at the end of the day, through all these processes, voters have the final say. The majority of California voters needs to back any of these revision processes. They all have their pros and cons, but rather than giving my take on those, I want to open it up to the panelists and to you guys to talk about what's the way forward to changing this living document that governs our state. So we have 3 wonderful speakers today. I apologize, my colleague Amy Bridges from UC San Diego couldn't be here. I may at the end, if we have some time, fill in. She's an expert in the history of California Constitution, so I can talk a little bit about that. But we may just leave it to our 3 speakers because they have so much expertise to lend you. The first will be Xander Caden from the California League of Women Voters. She's the vice president of the League for Governmental Affairs. She's also someone who's been involved both from the academic and the practitioner side of governmental reform. She's a professor of public policy at UCLA for many years, was involved in writing setting up the Ethics Commission in the city of Los Angeles, involved in charter reform, which is basically a constitutional convention for the city of Los Angeles. And now is heading up the League's efforts on this area. So she's going to start. Our next speaker will be Matt Regan of the Bay Area Council, www.repaircalifornia.org, as they always say, repaircalifornia.org. It's a great website, and this is the organization that is the main voice that, starting about a year ago, came up with this idea of having a constitutional convention. They've been the main voice pushing for it, both in Sacramento, but also with town hall meetings all across the state and soon to come to San Diego. So Matt Regan's their spokesperson and director of government relations, and he's going to be talking about their proposal. And finally, anchoring our discussion will be Gregory Morales from the Mexican-American Political Association. So Gregory's been an activist with a diverse history that has taken him from a U.S. Navy submarine to sociology conferences, and he describes himself as, I love this term, an organic intellectual, and he has wide-ranging thoughts about this. And the organization that he represents, MAPA, is one of the most important voices for a group that is of Californians that has always been central to the history of California. All right, so without further ado, let me start off with Xandra, and you're either, all the speakers can either come up here or I'll bring you the microphone, whichever you prefer.
Come to the podium.
Come on up.
Please have them come to the middle.
Okay, the photographer's asked you. Please go with
Some people have argued that it doesn't matter whether I'm standing or sitting, I'm not in the corner. But I deny that. I'm going to talk about why we're talking about constitutional reform. And I want to begin by saying that I think the genius of American society and throughout our history has been our capacity to change and to evolve. And it is not irrelevant that when we created our U.S. Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't one of the writers of it, but did make the point that we should go through this every 20 years. Other people have made that recommendation in other societies, but at this time, we seem to be closer to the period when we last went through major reform, which was to say the progressive era, which really designed much of what Southern California and Southwest looks like in terms of its government. At that time, from the beginning of the 20th century through 1924-25, the progressives were balancing themselves against the populists. These were the two major reform efforts going on in American society in response to the extraordinary change. And what is similar right now is the nature of the change. It was major immigration, changing American society from a middle-class European world to something that was open much more to the world. And in 1924, in fact, we closed our borders. When I was involved in charter reform in Los Angeles, and actually the Ethics Commission as well, at the time, Los Angeles was the most white Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle-class city in the nation. And today it is arguably the most diverse, if not in the nation, at least, if not in the world, at least in the nation. And there ought to be some correlation between the people who live, this is what I was arguing on the Ethics Commission. It wasn't the ethics, it was the structure. It was the structure that determines how things happen. The populists were the small farmers, particularly in the South, who were really being destroyed by the development of industrialization, what we like to refer to as robber barons, and the creation of corporations, the movement to the cities. The progressives suffered from the same thing, but they were a different set of the population. The progressives were small businessmen, people in medium to small sized towns who were losing standing as large corporations developed, and the money was accruing to others in enormous ways that we've never seen before. So the revolt of both the progressives and the populists was really against the development of great power in the hands principally of private capitalists, but also following the Civil War in the hands of the federal government. The thing that came out of that era, which largely affected us today, is the direct democracy which was implemented in California beginning in 1909, in Los Angeles, and then in 1910 in the state constitution. The direct democracy, as I'm sure you've all heard, was the initiative, the referendum, and recall. And it put power ultimately back in the hands of the people. And that worked pretty well, largely because it was unused. No, we're wrong, we don't do anything about it. Until about the middle of this century, when things did begin to get out of hand again, and people started moving, as Dad pointed out, the reforms of the 60s were very important in evolving the professionalism and in the 50s and 60s, also how California grew enormously from being just another large, beautiful western state to something that was considered the ultimate American dream. But as we began to use the initiative more and more, beginning with Prop 13 in a way, but not limited to that, it grew so much and became used by so many people that David Broder, who is the preeminent father of American political commentators, wrote a book called Democracy Derailed, in which he argues that we in California don't have a government of laws. We have laws without government. And that, to me, is one of the most profound statements made about how our society actually functions. Every time we want to do something, there's a group of people, or more importantly, a group of interests. If you have $1 million lying around, you can put that on the ballot. Now, it takes $1 million to get something on the ballot. That has nothing about the campaign itself. That's millions of dollars more. So the notion that the people actually had control over the initiative process presumed in a way that, you know, your neighbors would get together and you'd sign petitions and you'd get on the ballot and then people could vote on it. That's not the way it functions. We did miraculously, well, we didn't actually. Miraculously, we tried to put the redistricting initiative on the ballot without paid signature gatherers, but I think in the end we had to resort to that there as well. Not many normal, everyday people who are not engaged in major activities involved in money can actually get on the ballot. And we in the Legal Women Voters can attest to that in no way. Because we're often on the effort of people saying, well, join us. Actually, we do play an important role because most of the initiatives are so complicated and so complex that, one, we do spend a lot of time and energy explaining the pros and the cons of the initiatives, and many of you rely on the League to either come and talk to you about them or to go to our website, www.smartvoter.org, or to use our handouts on the subject. And you also look to see whether the League supports or opposes something. And in fact, that's how we mostly decide. We don't read the initiatives. We don't even read the synopsis of the initiatives. What we look to see is who's for it and against it. And then what happens is we vote on something and then the courts say, well, but that doesn't actually work that way, and there's a lot of frustration with the initiative process itself. The Constitution, the federal Constitution, presumes that interests will compete, but they'll come to the table and they'll compete with each other, and they will eventually work out a compromise, and from that compromise comes consensus. The problem with the initiative process is that it only gives you the opportunity for a yes or a no. It doesn't give you to say, well, but in this particular situation, or I sort of agree with that, but I think there's another thing to be said. The problem is it writes into the Constitution in concrete something that maybe should be more flexible, nuanced, maybe will come to be seen in another light a few years down the line. And it doesn't provide any way near a politics that promotes consensus or compromise. You win, you lose. And if you lose, you get angry. And our politics have grown increasingly divided by anger and by frustration. Unless you happen to be on the winning side. So one of the things we're concerned about is the increasing use of the initiative and the cost of using them. Among the issues we're mostly concerned about are things like the 2/3 rule for taxation over passing a budget. And this is so obvious today that this leads to tyranny of the minority. Now, democracy is based on the assumption that the minority can become the majority, which means they really got to try to become the majority. But in our 2/3 rule, the minority doesn't have to do that. The minority just has to hold to 1/3. They don't have to try to represent the whole state or the whole nation. And taxation, as we know in California, is a fighting word. But our tax system is hardly fair, and it's rigid, it's inflexible, and it fosters more inequities, I think, than you can say that it resolves. And when we particularly get in trouble is when the nation is in trouble and we're not flexible enough to switch funds around, because most of the Constitution is determined in terms of our spending by initiatives that have required spending of 40%, for instance, of state income for education. There's no shift in that. We also, right now, because of this problem, have the lowest bond rating of any state in the nation. And it isn't just because we don't have any money. It's because of our politics, because we can't make decisions. And the last time we tried to do, well, this is the last time how we finally succeeded in getting a budget. But that budget is going to hurt all of us a great deal. The other reason I particularly favor the notion of a constitutional reform, from someone who taught urban politics at UCLA, I can attest without any doubt at all that when you ask every Californian what they know about how our government runs, they recall one thing: the missions. Remembers making a mission out of matchsticks. Beyond that, they haven't a clue. Mission out of matchsticks. It would be a benefit to us as citizens, and people who want to be citizens, to actually learn something about how government functions. How it functions at the local level, the relationship between the local and the state and the county and the state and the federal level. That's one of the reasons I firmly believe that we are so frustrated. You know, we say we elect someone and they promise to do this and that and the other. Well, but they don't realize the limitations that there are, or why they're there. And I think that superhuman leadership maybe can overcome things, but most of our problem results in our structure and its rigidity. And I think I probably went over 10 minutes, but I'm willing to go on, and I'd like to say that I think that the reform of the state's constitution is something that we have come to realize affects all of us. There was an article in the LA Times about a month or so ago by Erwin Chemerinsky, who ran the elected charter commission, was the director of the president of the elected charter commission in California, in Los Angeles. Truly, it was a miracle that we got one, especially because there were two competing commissions. But Erwin said reform is a great idea, but knowing how difficult it was to get the reform in Los Angeles, he didn't think it was going to happen in the state. I disagree. The reform in Los Angeles for the city's charter was a battle between the mayor and the city council. Because nobody knew what went on and how it worked, nobody really cared very much. This is something we all see. We all know that there's a crisis in California. In fact, not only do we know it, the entire world knows about it. That is not going to bode well for us as a state into the future. This is something we know, we see, and we're going to see more of, and that's why we think it's important for us to engage in reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Sandra. My name is Matt Regan. I'm Director of Government Relations for the Bay Area Council. And you're probably all saying, the who, the what? We are a regional San Francisco Bay Area centered, business-sponsored public policy and advocacy organization. We work in areas of water, education, healthcare, environmental policy, all of the major issues of the day, and we advocate at the local, state, and federal levels to try and get a better water system for California, a better education system for California, and government reform is not something that comes naturally to us. It's not one of our core competencies. It's not something that our organization was founded and set up to do. But last year, I'll give you a little history as to what brought us to this point. Last year we went to Sacramento with about 40 Bay Area CEOs, companies like Google, Chevron, Oracle, AT&T, all the big names, and we brought them up to Sacramento in August to talk about water, education, healthcare, transportation infrastructure. We always go in August because we expected the budget would be done and the policymakers would be able to talk policy. And we got a conference room in the Capitol, and we brought in the big five, the leadership, to come talk to us. And nobody wanted to talk water, nobody wanted to talk education, nobody wanted to talk healthcare. They all wanted to talk about the budget because it hadn't been done. And not only did they want to talk about the budget, but they wanted to apportion blame. So we sat there with 40 high-level CEOs and senior executives, and Michael Lyons and Karen Bass were in the conference room together, pointing fingers at each other, blaming each other for the budget mess. And it was, to say the least, my job to organize this day and advance our agenda as a policy organization. It was very embarrassing. And one of the people who came to speak to us was then Senator Don Parada. And if you know Don, he's a very colorful character. And as he left, scratching his head, and he was very close to the end of his term, he just said, "You know what? We just need a constitutional convention. This doesn't work anymore." And we all, became public policy people. But yeah, constitutional convention. Yeah, we need one of those. And we all ran out of the room. What the heck is a constitutional convention? So, as Thad explained, the last time we did one of these was 1879. So we did a lot of research, a lot of digging around historical documents, looking at best practices in other states and other countries to see what a constitutional convention might look like, and if it's something that might actually work here in California. And our CEO, Jim Wunderman, wrote an op-ed for the San Francisco Chronicle a couple of days later, which they published, and calling for revision, reform to our Constitution, and that a constitutional convention is the way to do it. We write a lot of op-eds, mostly on policy areas, and 2 or 3 people read them. Your neighbor or your mom will call and say, "Hey, it's on your piece of paper." This particular op-ed had an amazing response. Our phones rang off the hook. We got emails, people saying, "How do we help? What do we do? The state is so broken, and we need to do something, and we don't see any other avenue or any other way to get this thing fixed." So we were sort of a little perplexed. We do. This is not what we do as an organization. So we started making phone calls. We called the League. We called the Antonio Velasquez Institute, Common Cause. We called all of the good government groups, the New America Foundation. We called pretty much everybody we knew. And we said, "Hey, what do you guys think about this?" And we built a coalition of groups of folks, of like-minded reform folks who all have different ideas on what needs fixing and different ideas on perhaps what avenues are the best to take. But everybody agrees that we're fundamentally broken and that we need structural reform. So the Constitutional Convention bandwagon has grown and grown and grown, and we are here a year later, a month away from submitting title and summary language for 2 initiatives to A, allow the citizens to call for a constitutional convention, and B, what that constitutional convention should look like. So I'll give you a little bit of you'll probably hear from the smarter people on the panel on what types of reforms we need and what they should look like, because our role in this whole process is not to come up with ideas or suggestions of what needs to be reformed. We like to see ourselves as sort of the independent kind of arbiter in all this. Our job in the Constitutional Convention is to produce a process that's as transparent as possible, and that's as open as possible, and that's as firewalled as possible from tinkering from the special interests. The only way this works. So while we have ideas, we are a special interest. We represent business, and business has interests and objectives that they would like to see. But our role in this is not to forward or advance those objectives. It's just to put in place a process that everybody can take a look at and go, yeah, that's fair. That represents the people of California. That gives everybody a fair shot at getting the types of reforms that they would like to see and protect the types of things that they like, that they have and hold dear. So the 2 big questions everybody asks: okay, Constitutional Convention, who sits on it, and what are they allowed to discuss? So the first sort of controversial question, who sits on it, is one that we've been scratching our heads on for a long time. It's a very, very difficult one to answer. We've looked at constitutional conventions in other states. Other states do these regularly. California's state that if we do have the authority, or rather the legislature has the authority to call a constitutional convention, but other states do them regularly. I think Illinois, Hawaii, Alabama, and other states do have them every 20 years, or at least it's in their constitution that the people have to decide if they want to have it. So we've looked at all those other states. Actually, probably the best example for those of you who are government nerds is British Columbia had a constitutional convention a couple of years ago, which had a very successful outcome, and we looked at a lot of the practices that they adopted, and we're looking very closely at some of those. So who sits on the convention? We looked at several models. The elected model, and we thought, well, what we elect people, and what would a constitutional convention look like? Well, our thinking on that was that, well, if it's an elected body, you'll have the public employee unions will run their slate of candidates. Business, we'll run our slate of candidates, and the faith-based groups will run their slate of candidates, and our Jarvis will run their slate of candidates, and we'll get a constitutional convention that looks like the legislature. A bunch of people who can't talk to each other and won't speak to each other. So we nixed that idea pretty early on. We looked at a constitutional convention of experts, appointed experts. And well, who would make the appointments? And well, the governor would make some, and the speaker pro tem, and each legislator would get one. And the more we sort of went down that road, we were kind of like, well, where do you stop? And plus the fact the Constitution as currently drafted says that a constitutional convention has to be geographically and demographically representative of the state. So you go down that route, and it gets very, very complicated. We also looked at the Prop 11 model from last year that the League so successfully put forward for redistricting. That's kind of a complicated process, and we did some polling, and folks, while they supported redistricting very strongly, the process by which the redistricting panel was selected had people perplexed. And this is, because this is such an important issue, we thought we can't go that way. If it's perplexing and confusing, it dies in the cradle. So we thought, well, probably the most open and transparent way to do this is through a jury pool selection. And it would be done, again, geographically representative. Sorry? Oh, sorry, a jury pool selection. Sorry, it would be along the lines of a grand jury. We would go to each, probably each assembly district. And one model we've looked at, one hybrid model we've looked at, is we would go to each assembly district, and let me backtrack a second. Probably the ideal size for a constitutional convention is around 400 to 500 members. That's the kind of size we look at. We've seen in other states that works best, with the best sort of group dynamics. And so we would go to each assembly district and select maybe 200 people from voter registration and DMV files, and take that group of 200 and take them into a room like this for a weekend. And they come Saturday morning, and we give them an 8-hour education on the Constitution, the types of problems that California currently faces. And then on Sunday they come back and they caucus, and they select 10 of their member to represent that assembly district in the Constitutional Convention. And that's a hybrid model. We think A, it's representative. B, you get to weed out some of the crazy people who would ordinarily come from a completely random sampling, and you'll get people who are A, intelligent, and B, who are interested and really want to do it. So that's sort of the model that we're looking at. It needs some tinkering, but it will be some form of a jury selection process. Then the next question folks always ask is, well, this is a Pandora's box. If you let these people run wild with the Constitution, they're going to tear everything apart, and you don't know what you get at the end of the day. I don't know if you've looked around the room. I'm probably this gentleman over here. The only people wearing suits and ties today. We're a very sober, conservative business organization. We're not grenade tossers. We don't start revolutions. We don't pass out pitchforks and flaming torches. We understand the risks that that a constitutional convention might bring. But we also have done a lot of legal research into how we can firewall the Constitutional Convention from potential damaging outcomes. So Prop 1A would be, when we go to the voters, would be amending the current Constitution to allow the people to call for a Constitutional Convention. Currently, as I explained, only the legislature can do that with a 2/3 vote, and that's never going to happen. And so we need 1A to amend the Constitution to allow us to call for one. And then Prop 1B would be what that constitutional convention should contain. You can we're going to, all the social issues, the culture war issues, the wedge issues, call them what you will, parent schools, choice, marriage, all off the table, not part of the discussion. And all of the interest groups that represent those different constituencies agree. They don't want their issues in our constitutional convention. This constitutional convention will address governance issues and nothing else. How do we govern ourselves as Californians, how the state runs. It won't address any of the social issues. So that we will firewall it to address just those issues. And that will be in Prop 1B. The people of California call for a constitutional convention to address these issues. So that's how it will work. There's some paperwork over here, if you haven't seen it, that has on the back page the timeline of how the constitutional convention will come about. So in September of this year, next month, September 25th, hopefully we will submit our language. We have a legal team working on Prop 1A and Prop 1B. Then we need to collect 2 million signatures by next April, and we're hoping to emulate with a little more success the League's efforts of last year to collect these signatures without paying paid signature gatherers. We want to build a people's army. This only succeeds if it's a popular effort. And the first step in doing that is to build an army of volunteers, folks who have civic-minded people who agree with what we're trying to do, collect the signatures. We submit those to the Secretary of State. Then in November of next year, in the general election, the people vote on 1A and 1B. And then the state within 6 months has to provide for a constitutional convention. How that convention will be structured and where it would take place, again, up for, not for us really to decide, but we like to think, it won't be a bunch of old white men in powdered wigs with quills. This will be a 21st century California constitutional convention. It will be electronic, it will be online, it will be interactive. People will be able to talk. While it will be firewalled from special interests, we will very strictly put language in the bill that any tampering with conventioneers, any violations of Brown Act stipulations will result in very stiff penalties for those involved. So if any special interest thinks they can go and lobby a group of conventioneers, they're looking at severe punishment for doing so. So it'll be like a jury, no tampering allowed, but so the Constitutional Convention will be held. We would envision it breaking out into working groups to address different, not every single conventioneer will address every single issue that Prop 1B initiates. So you'll have one group working on, say, the state and local government fiscal relationship, how that works. As you all know, it currently doesn't work. Anybody here from local government? Anybody? Yeah. So you're a victim of the latest budget malaise, where the state sort of, well, how do we balance our budget? We'll pick the pockets of the counties and the cities. So that needs to be fixed. That's something that I think everybody will agree upon is broken. We will have another group working on, say, electoral reform. How do we elect our elected officials? If you look at how we currently do it, you have the real race is pretty much all in the primaries, but the redistricting effort probably going to be tied up in the courts for a little while. We're not going to see a big change anytime soon in how we elect our elected officials. And because we have so many safe seats in California and very few competitive ones, the real race is in the primaries, so people run to the political extremes, and we get very right-wing Republicans and very left-wing Democrats, and when they go to Sacramento, they really just have nothing in common, can't talk to each other, and they don't represent the largely purple middle of California. They represent the extreme red and the extreme blue in a particular party persuasion. So we look at electoral reform and how do we get a more representative government. Look at budget reform, the 2/3 vote, the 2/3 vote for taxes. Everybody agrees that that's something that should be discussed. How should it be fixed? not for us to say, but it should be something that should be discussed. We are also asked a lot by different groups that we meet with to take their particular toy off the table. This is our favorite thing. You know, we'll support your constitutional convention if you take this off the table. We drafted an earlier draft of Prop 1B that said that people of California call for constitutional convention, blah, 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 blah. The property tax stipulations of Prop 13 shall not be discussed at a constitutional convention. And we looked at it and we sort of walked around the office and everybody, you know, we sort of mulled the idea for a few days and then we said no. In order to protect the integrity of this process, everything has to be on the table. No matter how popular Prop 13 polls, and you also have to remember that whatever the Constitutional Convention comes up with goes to the voters at the end of the day. So if the voters say blow up Prop 13, or sorry, if the Constitutional Convention says blow up Prop 13, the voters get the final say. Well, the Constitutional Convention has to have the authority to discuss every single issue that relates to our governance. So if we say, well, we'll take Prop 13 off the table, then we got to take Prop 42, and then we got to take Prop 98, and then pretty much you have a Constitutional Convention sitting in a room full of 500-pound gorillas that they're not allowed to talk about. So to protect the integrity of the process, everybody has to put their favorite toy on the table, hold hands, and jump together. Business community included. We probably stand to lose the most in the Constitutional Convention. We fully understand that. Probably the split roll tax is something that is the most popular idea out there right now to raise revenues. Business community hates that idea. But it's something that will probably come up in the convention. We can fully understand that. But for the greater good of the state, we understand that it's something that we have to risk having be part of the discussion. And we would ask everybody else in every other issue group in the state to join us in that effort. Put your toy on the table and jump. Hold hands with us and jump. I think, have I reached my 10 minutes? And more, but I'll be glad to take questions afterwards, and I hope I shed some light on what it is we're trying to do.
I'm Greg Morales from the Mexican American Political Association, and I came about this in a little bit different way. I've been in conversations with the Willie Velasquez Institute and MAFA National, and a few months ago I volunteered to write a position paper on the California Constitution. Well, I got busy because there's a lot of things I have personally that I would like to change or include, but I couldn't really do that because I'd never actually read the document. At USC last weekend, I checked it out at the San Diego County Law Library. I checked out the one copy that apparently has never been checked out before. And it was the only copy they had, and they wouldn't let me have this year's copy, so they gave me last year's copy. But luckily, I have a reference guide that's a reference guide to this year's copy. So between the two, I think I understand what's in the Constitution. And unlike my esteemed colleague here, I want to do something radical. I read the Constitution and I actually want to apply it. Because what's in the Constitution is rather amazing. It says in the Constitution that the people have the right to review government and to rewrite government or change government if it's not functioning. I think it's Section 2. Amazing. And it also says in the Constitution that the governor must appoint to commission the board membership that reflects the demographics of this whole state, not just a single group. Now, this is amazing to me because in doing my due diligence, my research, in the 1849 Constitution and the 1880 Constitution, there are many similarities. One of the similarities is there were no women included in either one of those documents. Another one is there were no Asian Americans included in that document. And there were also no black men or women included in the writing of this document or contributing to this document. And one of the things you can say is similar is they had a Latino in 1880 listed, and in 1849, 30% of the people that were listed were Latino. So you see the shifting of who's contributing to the structure of our governments And since it did not include women, and about 52% of our population is female, clearly it doesn't reflect the population. So we'd like to actually perhaps look at how this document is actually pretty well written. I mean, public utilities come under the preview of the population as a whole, of the people, not the governments or big business. So if you're selling water or electricity, the people have the right to review and inspect how each group is run. Not me, not whoever's mayor of San Diego or LA, but all of us. So, you know, I could go on and on about all the wonderful things inside of this document. We have to have real schools, safe schools for every single student, whether it's in college or in kindergarten. It's in the Constitution. I'm not making this up. It's radical. It's in here. So MAPA would like to suggest that, unlike the people at USC last weekend, where I asked who read the Constitution, and none of the people on the panel raised their hands, even elected officials. None of their staff raised their hands that they had read the Constitution of the state of California. And only 2 people in the entire room raised their hand that they read it, and I was one of those 2 people. So what the Mexican American Political Association would like to recommend as the important first step is to actually read the Constitution, that to require that all of our policymakers that are supposed to be using this as a framework for public policy actually read and apply the California Constitution. And from that point, perhaps we can move forward. For the document, the 2/3 vote, does not only also attaches to people that want to change the government. For if the people in the legislature, want to exclude people that want to change things and actually maybe follow the Constitution, it takes a 2/3 vote to silence that individual, or that small group of individuals that actually wants to change and have good government that actually works for the people. And I'm sad to say that it is my personal opinion that would be the one thing that 2/3 of our governments would vote on, would be to remove that individual. Thank you.